Today I'd like to do a quick tip video for the newer gardeners. Experienced gardeners, this probably won't apply to you, but feel free to stick around and give suggestions, recommendations, comments, tips, tricks to all of our newer gardeners. I want to talk about which crops to direct sow, and one of my biggest tips is look at the size of the seed. The larger the seed, the more energy is in there. The more energy there is, the more likely you are to have a bigger seedling, a faster growing seedling. The smaller the seed, the smaller the seedling, the slower it's going to grow. So as long as you keep in mind that the bigger seeds should just be tossed outside after last frost, that's going to take care of like 80% of your questions as to what to start inside, what to start outside. It's important to remember that your growing zone and your last frost date, first frost date, all of that's going to affect what you can and cannot grow within your growing season window. So while tomatoes and peppers are typically started indoors, in my growing zone, I could technically throw some seeds outside and they will fruit just fine and plentifully before the end of the season. But for our northern gardeners, if they tried to do that, they might be lucky to see their first blossom or their first green fruit before the plant's taken out by a freeze. So please remember that your local climate is really going to play a big part in whether or not some of these crops will fruit by the end of the season. So you will have to head over to Google and make sure that you know how long it's going to take your seeds to go from sprouting to fruiting. But in any case, let's move forward. First, we have stuff like cantaloupes, melons, cucumbers, corn, all of your larger seeded crops. These guys, you pop them in the ground and they sprout within several days. Very large seedlings, they grow very quickly, especially stuff like winter squash. These are things that you're probably not going to want to start indoors, and if you do, you're going to quickly realize that you have to up-pot them frequently, and you may really struggle to transplant them. They don't like their roots disturbed. Corn really does not like its roots disturbed, so if you want these crops to be as successful as possible, usually starting them in ground is going to yield better results because the transplant shock is going to stall them out, and it's probably going to take all of those days you gained through starting indoors back from you. So you're probably going to start back at square one with that. So it's just a great idea to go ahead and direct sow all those. Next, we have your large flower seeds. You may think of stuff like zinnias, cosmos, sunflowers, all of those larger seeded varieties. And then you also have your flowers that you're going to sow in mass. So if you want wildflowers like black-eyed Susan or phlox or anything like that, you may want to throw those outside because you are going to have to grow a lot of transplants if you want a wall of color. Most of these are very fast growing, so you don't have to worry about losing time during the season for most of them. If you're wondering what those dark seeds are, they're hyacinth beans. Pretty cool, right? Next, we have our cover crops. Most are likely to already assume that you need to direct sow these because they're generally going to cover your whole garden, or they're going to cover a pasture, so a pasture seed mix or a forage mix. All of these are typically sown outside, so this might include alfalfa, crimson clover, oats, rye, whatever it may be. All of those are direct sow as well. But for these, you need to ensure that you're sowing the right crop at the right time. You don't want to be sowing fall forages or fall cover crops during the spring. They're not going to work out quite as well for you. Now, if you're sowing them in early spring to chill under, that's a different story. But in any case, these pasture mixes, forage crops, cover crops, they're all intended to be started outdoors for a variety of uses. Lastly, we have root crops. Root crops are going to be a little bit of the exception to my rule, kind of like the cover crops, because cover crop seeds can be small as well. Root crops should always be sown in ground, and that's because they do not enjoy having their roots disturbed, and a lot of them are very quick growing, like turnips, radishes, and beets. If you disturb the long taproot that these seedlings put out, it can cause you to have stunted fruits. Your carrots could fork, they could curl up, they could do all kinds of crazy things. Some of them you may not plant as deeply as you're supposed to at transplant, so you may wind up with plants that just don't produce well, or they don't produce much, or maybe they just kind of fizzle out because they're not planted at the correct depth. So for all of your root crops, go ahead and direct sow those to avoid some heartache, especially carrots. Those are some of the finest seeds that you're going to find with the root veggies. Make sure you plant those directly in ground. It'll save you so much grief. Onions are one of the ones that you can sow in ground. Here we have green onions, and you can just sow those outside. However, if you are wanting to transplant onions for perfect spacing, these are a good one to opt for indoors. So this is a tricky one because you can either do it in or out. But if you're trying to grow large bulbed onions, it's wise to start them indoors. Thank you guys for dropping in, and I hope y'all are having so much fun digging in your gardens. Let's get planting.